The ink was barely dry on the divorce papers when I called my father. I was still sitting in the parking garage of the Hensley and Cross law firm, engine off, hands in my lap, staring at the copy of the settlement agreement, sitting on the passenger's seat. 34 years old, 7 years of marriage, and somehow I felt more like myself in that moment than I had in years. I picked up the phone and called Dad. He answered on the second ring, the way he always does. Nora. Just my name, but I could hear everything in it. The relief, the worry he'd been carrying for months. It's done, I said. A pause. Then, come home. I didn't go home that night. I drove to the office instead. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense without the beginning. My father, Edmund, built Callaway Architecture from a two-person firm in a rented office in Phoenix into one of the most respected mid-size practices in the Southwest. 31 years of work. His name is on the building. Literally, it's etched into the glass panel above the entrance, Callaway Design Group. And every time I walked through those doors growing up, I felt it like a hand on my shoulder. He brought me into the firm 7 years ago as a junior project manager. I had my license, I had my master's, and I had something to prove. I worked 70-hour weeks. I pulled all-nighters on the Henderson development bid. I was the one who caught the structural miscalculation on the Mesa Verde project that would have cost us a $2.3 million penalty. Dad made me a senior associate at 29, which raised some eyebrows from people who'd been there longer, but he told them plainly, she earned it. That's who I was before I met Garrett. I met Garrett Finch at a charity gala for the Phoenix Children's Hospital. He was charming in the way that certain men are charming. Effortlessly, like it cost him nothing, like he'd been born knowing exactly what to say. He was in commercial real estate, he said. Development consulting. We probably overlap, he told me, smiling over his glass of wine. You design them, I sell the land they sit on. I thought that was clever. I was wrong about a lot of things. We dated for 8 months. He was attentive, funny, endlessly curious about my work. He came to site visits. He asked questions about load-bearing design that turned out later to be less about intellectual curiosity and more about understanding how the firm operated. But I didn't know that yet. I was in love, or something that felt enough like it to make me careless. Dad had reservations. He never said it outright. That wasn't his style. But I could see it in the way he shook Garrett's hand at dinner. The way he asked follow-up questions about the development projects Garrett mentioned. Then went quiet when the answers were vague. Be careful, he said to me once, just once, and I told him he was being overprotective. We got married 18 months after we met. Small ceremony, backyard of a friend's ranch property outside Scottsdale. I thought it was romantic. Dad gave a toast that was kind and careful, and said nothing untrue. 3 months after the wedding, Garrett asked me about an opening at the firm. I should have hesitated. I know that now. But he framed it so reasonably. He said he was tired of the volatility of development consulting, that he wanted something more stable, that he admired what Dad had built and thought he could contribute. He had a background in client relations and project coordination. On paper, it wasn't unreasonable. I talked to Dad. Dad said it was my decision. He meant it as a warning. I heard it as permission. Garrett joined Callaway Design Group as a client relations coordinator in the spring, about 8 months into our marriage. Within 6 weeks, he had suggested that his mother, Harriet, might be a good fit for the office manager position that had just opened up. Harriet was organized, he said, experienced. She'd managed the administrative side of a dental practice for 12 years. Within 4 months of Harriet starting, Garrett's younger brother, Owen, had joined as a project logistics specialist, a title that hadn't existed before Owen needed a job. Then came Garrett's college friend, a man named Brett, hired as an external partnerships liaison. Again, a title created specifically for him, and a salary I later discovered was $20,000 above what anyone else in a comparable role was making. I didn't see it clearly then. That's the thing about being inside something. You can't always feel the walls closing in. I was busy. I was managing 3 major projects simultaneously and logging more billable hours than anyone on staff. I told myself that Garrett was settling in, that he was trying to build something, that families work together all the time. But I started noticing small things. A client I'd been cultivating for 2 years suddenly shifted their point of contact to Garrett without telling me. A vendor contract that usually crossed my desk for review got signed off before I saw it. When I mentioned it to Dad, he said he'd look into it, but the follow-up never came, and I didn't push. Then my father had his heart attack. It was a Tuesday in October. He collapsed in his office just after lunch. His assistant Pauline called me. and I drove to the hospital doing 80 on the freeway with my hazards on. It was a moderate event, the cardiologist said, which is doctor language for, it could have been much worse. He spent 4 days in the hospital and came home with a fistful of new prescriptions and orders to reduce his stress load significantly. Dad handed me temporary operational authority over the firm while he recovered. Garrett was in the room when that conversation happened. I remember thinking it was fine, that he was my husband, that of course he'd be present. But looking back, I can still see the way his expression shifted. Just slightly, just for a moment, when Dad said the words. Not surprise, something else. The next 8 weeks were the busiest of my life. I was running the firm, managing active projects, visiting Dad twice a week, to go over anything that needed his signature, and somewhere in there I was also trying to hold a marriage together. That I was only beginning to understand was hollow. It was Pauline who first said something to me directly. Pauline had been with my father for 19 years. She's the kind of woman who knows where every document is, who remembers every client's birthday, who has never once raised her voice in the office. She knocked on my door one afternoon and closed it behind her and said, very quietly, "Nora, I think you should look at the vendor invoices from the last 2 quarters." She put a folder on my desk and walked out. I almost didn't open it. I was exhausted, and I had a site meeting in an hour, and I told myself I'd get to it later. But something made me open it right then. The numbers were wrong. Not wrong in a way that was immediately obvious. Whoever had done it was careful. But I had been looking at Callaway's books long enough to feel when something was off, and something was very, very off. There were duplicate invoice payments to a vendor called Finch Logistics Solutions that I had never seen referenced in any project file. Finch Logistics Solutions. I sat with that name for a full minute before I pulled up the Arizona Business Registry. Finch Logistics Solutions, LLC. Registered 14 months prior. Registered agent, Owen Finch, Garrett's brother. I closed my office door. I sat very still, and then I started pulling every thread I could find. What I found over the next 3 weeks, with the help of an outside forensic accountant I hired without telling anyone, including Dad, because I didn't want to risk his health until I was certain, was this. Over the course of approximately 16 months, a series of fraudulent vendor payments had been routed through Finch Logistics Solutions and a second shell entity called Premier Project Services. The total amount was just under $380,000. The payments had been authorized through a combination of Garrett's sign-off as Client Relations Coordinator and Brett's authorization as External Partnerships Liaison, with Harriet's name appearing on several of the original invoice approvals in her capacity as office manager. $380,000. Siphoned out of my father's firm while he was recovering from a heart attack. I didn't cry when I confirmed the numbers. I think I was too far past it by then. I sat in my car in the parking lot of the forensic accountant's office, and I called my divorce attorney. I'd already spoken to her twice in the previous weeks, because I had begun to understand that the marriage was also going to end. And I said, I need to talk about next steps. I filed for divorce on a Thursday. I retained separate legal counsel for the civil and potential criminal aspects of the fraud. I did not tell Garrett I had found anything. I went home that night and made dinner and watched television and said goodnight and felt like I was made of glass. The divorce filing hit him on a Monday morning. His attorney called mine within 2 hours. Garrett called me 14 times. I didn't answer. I called Dad that evening. He had to sit down twice during the conversation. When I finished explaining everything, he was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "Tell me what you need me to do." "I need you to come into the office tomorrow," I said, "and I need you to terminate Garrett's employment, Owen's employment, Brett's employment, and Harriet's employment, effective immediately, for cause." "Done," he said. No hesitation. The next morning, Dad walked into Callaway Design Group for the first time in 6 weeks. I was already there. I'd arrived at 7. I'd spent the weekend coordinating with our employment attorney, documenting everything, ensuring that the terminations were legally clean and properly sequenced. When Dad came in, he looked tired but steady. He looked like himself. We held the terminations one by one, starting at 9:30. Garrett was first. I sat in the corner of the room while Dad conducted it, because this was still his firm, and these were his words to say. Dad put the forensic report on the table in front of Garrett and said, "I think you know what this is." Garrett looked at the report. Then he looked at me. His expression went through several things very quickly. Shock, then calculation, then something that wanted to look like wounded dignity. Nora, he said, whatever you think, don't talk to her, my father said. His voice was quiet. Talk to me. You worked for me. You stole from me. And you're going to leave this building in the next 15 minutes. Garrett left. He didn't say another word. Owen's termination took 4 minutes. Brett didn't show up for work that day. Later, I learned he had called in sick, which told me that Garrett had probably warned him. His termination notice was sent by registered mail and email. Harriet's termination was last. Harriet was different. She sat across from my father and me with her hands folded on the table, and for a moment she looked simply like a 61-year-old woman who had been caught doing something she knew was wrong. There was a particular quality to her stillness, not calm, exactly, but calculated, like she was running through options. I was following Garrett's direction, she said. I didn't understand the full scope. Your signature is on 11 invoice approvals, Dad said. That's the full scope. She left without another word. I thought that was the end of the worst of it. I was wrong. That same evening, I was at my father's house. I'd been staying with him since the filing because I didn't want to be alone, and he didn't want me to be either. When a car pulled up in front of the house just after 8 o'clock, then another car, then a third. I was in the kitchen when I heard it. A sound I didn't immediately recognize, high, sharp, like someone calling out. I looked out the front window and felt the air leave my body. Harriet was standing at the end of my father's front walk in the dark, and with her were what looked like most of Garrett's extended family. His aunt and 2 cousins from his mother's side. His sister, Renee. No, I need to correct myself. A woman I recognized as his sister. People I'd met at holidays, at birthday dinners, at the wedding, I now wished with everything in me I could take back. Someone had made signs. Actual signs, on poster board, in red marker. I couldn't read what they said from the window, but the intent was clear enough. And then I saw the kids. Garrett had a son from a relationship before we met. His name was Miles, and he was 9 years old, and he was standing in the middle of that group, looking frightened and confused, holding the hand of his 6-year-old cousin Emma, who had apparently been brought along as well. Neither of those children had any idea what they were doing there. Miles was in his school clothes. Emma was still in her coat. That detail, those 2 kids standing on my father's front walk in the cold, made me angrier than anything else that had happened in the previous 3 weeks. I went outside. Harriet started before I had both feet on the porch step. Her voice carried easily through the quiet neighborhood, and I was acutely aware of lights flickering on in windows up and down the street. You think you can just throw us out, she said. After everything we did for that firm. After everything Garrett put into. Garrett stole from my father's company, I said. That is what happened. And you helped him. You're ending a marriage over money, she said. You're destroying a family. I'm protecting my family, I said, and my father's business, which your son spent 16 months treating like his personal bank account. She shifted then. Something in her expression changed, and she looked down at Miles and then back at me, and I realized with a sick feeling what she was about to do. Miles, she said. Go tell Nora what you told Grandma. The boy's face, a child's face asked to carry something too heavy. He looked at his grandmother, then at me. His eyes were big. Don't, I said clearly, looking directly at Harriet. Don't do that. Don't put him in the middle of this. He wants his father to come home, Harriet said. His father made choices, I said. Miles didn't make them. And you should be ashamed of yourself for bringing him here. I looked at Miles directly. Hey, I said softer, this isn't about you. None of this is your fault. Do you understand me? He nodded, very slightly. I took out my phone. I'm calling the police, I told Harriet. Not because I'm afraid of you, but because you've brought 2 children out here at 8 o'clock at night to stand on someone's private property, and that ends right now. You won't. I was already dialing. She stopped talking. My father had come out onto the porch behind me. I heard him, felt his presence, didn't look back. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The police arrived in 11 minutes. 2 officers, both patient, both professional. They asked Harriet and the group to leave. Harriet tried to make a speech to the officers about injustice, about family, about what had been taken from them. One of the officers listened to her for about 45 seconds and then explained, very calmly, that they were on private property after the owner had asked them to leave, and that continuing to refuse would result in arrest. Before Harriet got back in her car, she looked at me one more time. You think you've won something, she said. I think I went back to work, I said. That's all. One of Garrett's cousins tried to take Miles with them. I watched Miles look at the car and then look at the ground, and something in me just, I couldn't let it go. I walked over to the officer and said quietly, "The boy lives with his mother in Tempe. Her name is Janelle. She should know he's here." "I don't think she knows." The officer nodded. He asked Harriet for the mother's contact information. Harriet refused. The officer called it in himself. Janelle arrived 22 minutes later, furious and frightened, and she took both children. Emma was her niece, home with her. Miles looked back at me once as he got into his mother's car. I waved. He didn't wave back, but his shoulders dropped about an inch, and I thought that was enough. The civil case moved faster than I expected. Our attorney filed suit against Garrett, Owen, Brett, and Harriet individually and jointly. The forensic evidence was clean and extensive. Garrett's attorney reached out within 3 weeks to discuss settlement terms. I told our attorney that we were not interested in settling unless it covered the full amount plus legal fees plus interest, and that if Garrett preferred to take it to court, we were prepared to do that. They settled. It took 4 months. The full $380,000 plus $47,000 in legal fees and interest paid out through a combination of Garrett's personal assets and a lien on Owen's property. Brett entered into a separate agreement. Harriet, who had the fewest assets, agreed to a payment plan overseen by the court. Additionally, the Maricopa County District Attorney's Office opened a criminal investigation based on the evidence our attorney forwarded. Garrett was charged with 4 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of theft by deception. Owen was charged with 2 counts of fraud. At the time I'm writing this, both cases are still working through the court system, but our attorney says the evidence is strong. I filed the final divorce paperwork, while the civil settlement was still being finalized. Arizona is a community property state, but my attorney had been careful. In the prenuptial agreement Dad had gently suggested, and that I had initially bristled at, turned out to be the most important document I'd signed before the divorce decree. "I love you, Dad. You were right. I will say it as many times as you need to hear it." The day after the settlement was signed, I went to see my mother. She passed away 6 years ago, and she's buried at a small cemetery outside Mesa, near the property where she grew up. I don't go as often as I should. That afternoon, I sat down on the grass beside her headstone and stayed there for a while, not saying much, just being there. She would have known something was wrong with Garrett long before I did. She had a quality I've never been able to fully name. A kind of quiet precision in the way she read people. A patience with her own observations that I've never quite mastered. She would have called me on a Tuesday evening a year into the marriage, asked how things were going at work, listened to my answer, and said something simple and accurate that would have made me stop and think. I miss her most, in the moments when I most need someone to tell me the truth. I drove back from the cemetery with the windows down even though it was February and cold because I needed the air and the noise. I thought about what the next year would look like. I thought about the firm, about the projects in progress, the staff who had stayed through all of it, Pauline, who had put a folder on my desk and changed everything. I promoted Pauline the week after the terminations. Director of Operations. She cried a little, then told me to stop being sentimental and get back to work. I thought about Miles too. I'd heard through a mutual contact that he was back with his mother full-time. I hoped he was okay. I hoped someone was explaining things to him in the right kind of way, or at least making sure he knew that none of it had been his fault. Kids carry things they shouldn't have to carry, and they do it quietly, and you don't always find out, until later, how much weight they were holding. I thought about Garrett, wherever he was, working with his attorney on a defense for charges that stemmed from his own choices. I didn't feel triumphant about it. I felt tired and clear, which is a different thing. 3 months after the settlement, Dad officially updated the succession plan at the firm. My name, Nora Calloway, is now listed as managing principal alongside his, which is a title that carries operational authority, financial oversight, responsibility, and a seat at the table I've earned every day for the past 7 years. He told me over lunch. He slid a copy of the updated document across the table the same way he does with anything important. Matter of fact, no ceremony, the way of a man who believes that the work speaks for itself. I looked at my name on the page for a long moment. "You knew," I said. "Before I did. You knew something was wrong." "I thought something might be," he said. "I didn't know what, and I couldn't prove it. And you were building something, and I didn't want to be the one who." He stopped, cleared his throat. "You found it yourself. That matters. It took me too long." "It took you exactly as long as it needed to," he said. "You got there." We ate the rest of lunch mostly in silence, which is something we've always been comfortable with, my father and I. Silence, that means something is fine. Not silence, that means something is broken. Outside the restaurant window, Phoenix looked the way it always does in early spring. Bright and dry and still. The light coming down at an angle that makes everything look like it was just built yesterday. I've spent my whole life in this city. I know its bones in a way I don't know anywhere else. I picked up the document and folded it and put it in my bag. There was still a full afternoon of work waiting for me. A structural review on the Midtown Commons project, a client call about the timeline on a mixed-use development in Chandler, and a hire I needed to finalize for the project coordination role we'd had open since the spring. I left the restaurant and walked back to the office, into the building with my family's name above the door, and sat down at my desk and got back to work. That's all I ever wanted to do. I just needed to do it without anyone taking from me while I wasn't looking. I won't make that mistake again.